What would you do if the person sleeping under your roof, the person your child was supposed to call family, turned out to be the most dangerous presence in the house? What would you do if the warning signs were there all along, hiding in plain sight, disguised as discipline, disguised as authority, disguised as love? And what would you do if, in the single moment everything finally cracked open, the reaction from the people around you wasn't horror, but approval? Because that's exactly where this story begins. Not with a stranger, not with someone from the outside, but with someone who had a key, a seat at the dinner table, and a title that was supposed to mean safety. My daughter was 14 when Marcus moved in. I want you to hold that number for a second. 14. That age where a girl is old enough to sense danger, but young enough to have no power to stop it. She wasn't his biological child. He knew that. We all knew that. But when I agreed to build a life with this man, I believed, genuinely believed, that the love I felt for him would somehow extend to her by default. That's the first mistake I'll own in this story, and I'm owning it early because what comes next has nothing to do with my blindness and everything to do with his choices. The first few months felt almost normal. Marcus had rules, firm ones, and I told myself that structure was good for her. He didn't like loud music after 9. He didn't like her friends coming over unannounced. He didn't like backtalk, which, sure, what parent does? But the way his jaw tightened when she pushed back even slightly, that wasn't frustration. That was something older and colder than frustration, and I filed it away in that part of my brain where uncomfortable truths go to wait. The slap happened on a Tuesday. I need you to understand how ordinary that Tuesday was. Dinner was already on the stove, the news was on low in the background, and my daughter had simply forgotten to put her school bag away before sitting down. That was it. That was the entire reason. She forgot to put her bag by the door instead of leaving it at the bottom of the stairs. Marcus said something. She said she'd do it after dinner. And before the last word left her mouth, his hand connected with the side of her face so hard that she stumbled into the wall behind her. The sound it made is not something I will describe more than once in this story, because some sounds don't need repeating to be understood. What I will tell you is that the kitchen went completely silent except for the television, some anchor talking about the weather forecast for the weekend, and for about 4 seconds, nobody in that room moved or breathed. Those 4 seconds are where everything changed. Not because of the slap alone, though make no mistake, that alone was enough. Those 4 seconds changed everything because of what happened inside them. My daughter pressed her hand to her face and looked at me. Not at him. At me. And the look in her eyes wasn't just pain. It was a question. It was the question every child asks without words when the adult who is supposed to protect them fails to move. Are you going to do something, or is this just how it is now? I didn't answer that question fast enough. And the silence that followed, the silence where I stood frozen between shock and disbelief, was long enough for someone else in that room to fill it first. Marcus's mother, who had been sitting at that table the entire time, set down her fork, looked at my daughter, and laughed. That laugh is where this story really starts. And you are not ready for what comes next. There are moments in life that split everything into before and after. Not the dramatic ones you see coming, not the arguments that build for weeks or the ultimatums delivered at full volume. The ones that actually rewire you are the quiet ones. The ones that last 4 seconds. The ones where somebody laughs at the wrong time, in the wrong room, at the wrong child, and you realize with absolute clarity that you have been living inside a lie that was constructed specifically to keep you comfortable enough not to look too closely. Patricia, that was his mother's name, had been sitting at my dinner table for 11 months by that Tuesday. 11 months of me cooking her food, washing guest towels for her visits, and telling my daughter to be respectful toward her because family deserves patience. 11 months of small comments I excused as generational differences. She once told my daughter that girls who speak too loudly in the presence of men make themselves look foolish. I told myself she was old-fashioned. I told myself it was harmless. I filed it in the same drawer where I'd been storing every other thing about this family that quietly didn't sit right. When Patricia laughed, And I need you to understand it wasn't a nervous laugh, it wasn't an uncomfortable reflex, it was a full, satisfied, almost relieved laugh. Something in my chest didn't break. It hardened. There's a difference. Breaking implies falling apart. What happened to me in that moment was the opposite. Every soft, accommodating, benefit of the doubt part of me calcified into something I didn't fully recognize yet, but would come to rely on completely in the weeks ahead. My daughter still had her hand pressed to her face. She hadn't moved from the wall. And Patricia picked her fork back up. Like punctuation. Like the moment was already over, and the meal deserved more attention than the 14-year-old girl standing 3 feet away with a red handprint forming on her cheek. Marcus hadn't apologized. He hadn't even looked at my daughter again. He pulled his chair back slightly, crossed his arms, and waited, and I understood then that he was waiting to see what I would do. This was a test. Not of my daughter. Of me. I failed it that night. I want to be transparent about that because this story isn't about me being a hero from the start. It's about what happens when a woman finally stops failing a test she never should have been given in the first place. I told my daughter to go to her room. My voice was steady in a way that scared even me. I didn't look at Patricia. I didn't look at Marcus. I just cleared 2 plates from the table, walked to the kitchen sink, and stood there with the water running for a very long time. What I didn't know, what I couldn't have known standing at that sink, was that my daughter wasn't crying in her room. She was sitting on the edge of her bed, methodically peeling a small piece of tape from her nightstand drawer and pressing it over a corner of a notebook she had been hiding under her mattress for 4 months. A notebook I wouldn't find for another 3 weeks. A notebook that, when I finally opened it, made that Tuesday feel like the most minor entry in a much longer and much darker record that my child had been quietly keeping all by herself because she had already decided, long before that slap, that telling me wasn't a safe option. That notebook is why Marcus no longer has the life he had. But we're not there yet. First, you need to understand exactly what my daughter believed about me and why she believed it. Have you ever held something in your hands that completely dismantled the version of yourself you thought you were? Not a mirror. Not a harsh word from someone who doesn't know you. Something written by someone who knows you better than anyone alive, someone who loves you, and whose words make it undeniable that your love, however real it felt to you, had gaps in it large enough for a child to fall through silently and alone? That notebook was 43 pages. I counted them. Because my brain needed something mechanical to do, while the rest of me came completely undone on my daughter's bedroom floor at 2 in the morning while she slept 6 feet away, unaware that I had finally found it. She had titled it nothing. No name on the cover, no date on the first page. She had simply started writing, the way people write when they need somewhere to put things that have no other place to go. The first entry was from 4 months before that Tuesday. 4 months. That means while I was planning weekend dinners and making room in the closet for Marcus's things and telling myself we were building something real, my daughter was already documenting what was happening behind the version of our life that I was allowed to see. The entries weren't dramatic in the way you might expect. That's what made them so devastating. She didn't write in the language of crisis. She wrote in the language of a teenager who had already normalized something that should never have been normalized. Matter-of-fact observations, recorded like weather reports. He took my phone for 3 days because I laughed too loud during a movie. He told me at breakfast that I was getting too comfortable forgetting my place. I didn't say anything back because last time I said something back he grabbed my arm and squeezed it until I stopped talking, and I don't want that to happen again, so I'm writing it here instead. That last line is the one that put me on the floor. Not because of what he did, though what he did was already enough to ignite something in me that would not be extinguished quietly, but because of the reasoning. I don't want that to happen again, so I'm writing it here instead. My daughter had done a risk assessment. At 14, she had weighed her options, concluded that speaking to me carried consequences she wasn't willing to risk, and chosen a notebook over her own mother. That was the verdict she had reached about my home, about my choices, and about the safety I had or had not provided her. There were 11 entries in total. Some short, a single line about a look he gave her that made her lock her bedroom door. Some longer, a full page about a night I was working late when he came to her doorway and stood there without speaking for long enough that she pretended to be on a phone call to make him leave. Nothing in that notebook crossed into territory I will detail further here, but I will tell you this. Every entry together painted a picture of a man who had been steadily testing boundaries, steadily pushing, steadily measuring exactly how much he could take from a child before someone in that house noticed. And the answer he had arrived at, based on 4 months of uninterrupted evidence, was that he could take quite a lot. The last entry was dated 5 days before the slap. It said only this: "I think he knows I won't tell. I think that's why he's getting less careful." She was right. And she had been alone with that knowledge for 4 months while I slept peacefully in the next room, believing I had built something worth trusting. I closed the notebook. I did not sleep. And by morning, I had made a decision that would change every life in that house permanently. Have you ever watched someone work a room and felt genuinely impressed, not by what they were saying, but by how effortlessly they made every person in that room feel like the most important one there? That was Marcus. That was the version of him that existed everywhere outside our front door, and if you had asked anyone in our neighborhood, anyone at his job, anyone at the church he attended twice a month with just enough consistency to be noticed, they would have told you the same thing without hesitation. Good man. Solid man. The kind of man who remembers your kid's name and asks about your mother's surgery and shows up to help you move furniture on a Saturday without being asked twice. That was the Marcus the world had access to. And that Marcus was so convincingly constructed that even I, living inside the same walls as the other version, spent months doubting my own perception. He worked in property management, mid-level, respectable, the kind of job that comes with a company truck and a shirt with his name embroidered on the chest and a calendar full of appointments that gave him legitimate reasons to be places and legitimate reasons to leave. He was organized. He was punctual. He returned calls. These are not remarkable qualities in isolation, but in the context of the image he was building, they were load-bearing walls. Because a man who is reliably, visibly competent in public generates a specific kind of social credit that is almost impossible to spend down quickly. People don't want to believe the punctual man with the embroidered shirt is capable of grabbing a teenager's arm in the kitchen until she stops talking. I had met Marcus through a mutual friend 18 months before he moved in. The courtship, and I use that word deliberately because looking back it was exactly that, a performance with intention behind every gesture, lasted 7 months before he suggested we take the next step. 7 months of dinners where he always paid, always pulled the chair out, always asked about my daughter by name and remembered the details I'd mentioned the week before. He sent her a birthday card the month before we made things official. A card with a handwritten note inside that said he was looking forward to getting to know her better and that he hoped she'd give him a chance to be someone she could count on. I kept that card. I kept it in a drawer in my bedroom because I thought it was evidence of who he was. It was evidence of who he needed me to believe he was. There is a profound difference between those two things, and the distance between them is exactly where my daughter lived for 11 months, in the gap between the man I had decided he was and the man she was experiencing behind closed doors every single day. What I began to understand the morning after I found that notebook was that the mask wasn't something Marcus put on occasionally. It was structural. It was the primary project. The control, the intimidation, the carefully rationed cruelty inside our home, none of that was him losing control. It was the opposite. It was a man who understood exactly how much social armor a well-maintained public reputation provides, and who was deliberately, strategically spending that armor down in private because he had correctly calculated that people with good reputations are the last ones anyone investigates. He had built himself a life designed to be unbelievable. And for a long time, it worked. It worked on our neighbors. It worked on his co-workers. It worked on the mutual friend who introduced us. It worked on me. It did not work on a 14-year-old girl with a notebook under her mattress. And it was about to stop working on her mother entirely. When does discipline become control? At what exact point does a household rule stop being about raising a child and start being about breaking one? Those aren't rhetorical questions. They're the questions I sat with every single day for 11 months without ever letting myself answer them honestly, because answering them honestly would have meant admitting something I wasn't ready to admit about the choice I had made and the man I had made it with. The rules in our house didn't arrive all at once. That's the part one need you to understand before anything else in this module, because if they had arrived all at once, I would have seen them for what they were. Instead, they came the way water shapes rock, slowly, consistently, unremarkably, until the landscape had changed completely and you couldn't remember what it looked like before. The first rule was the bag by the door. You already know about that one. But before the bag, there was the volume rule. No television above a certain level after 8, which seemed reasonable. Then the phone rule. No phones at the dinner table, which again, most parents would argue is fair. Then the kitchen rule. My daughter was not to take food from the refrigerator after 9 without asking first, because Marcus said he needed to manage the grocery budget carefully. That one gave me a pause I swallowed. Then the bedroom door rule. It was to remain open at least 6 inches at all times when she was home alone with him, which he framed as a transparency measure, as proof that he had nothing to hide. I believed that framing completely. I believed it so thoroughly that I actually felt grateful for it. Each rule, examined individually, had a surface logic that made resistance feel unreasonable. That was the architecture of it. He wasn't building a prison with bars. He was building one with policies, with rationale, with the language of a reasonable adult making reasonable household decisions. And every time my daughter pushed back, even slightly, the consequences were calibrated perfectly to be just below the threshold of what I would classify as unacceptable. Not a slap. Not yet. A look. A silence that lasted a beat too long. A privilege quietly disappeared without explanation. Her best friend stopped being welcome at our house in month 4. Marcus explained it as a boundary issue. The friend was disrespectful and he didn't want that energy in our space. I nodded. My daughter said nothing. The notebook, I would later learn, recorded that conversation verbatim. By month 7, she had stopped inviting friends over entirely. By month 8, she had stopped mentioning school events that required a parent's evening attendance because Marcus had made it clear, without ever quite saying it directly, that her activities were an inconvenience to the schedule he preferred. By month 9, she was eating dinner faster than she used to, finishing before he did, clearing her plate and disappearing upstairs with a quietness that I interpreted as teenage moodiness, and that was in reality something far more practiced and deliberate. She was minimizing her surface area. She was making herself smaller, faster, less visible, not because she was going through a phase, but because she had learned through months of precise, consistent pressure that smaller and faster and less visible meant fewer opportunities for things to go wrong. This is what prolonged psychological conditioning looks like inside a home that from the outside has a wreath on the door and a welcome mat that means nothing. It doesn't announce itself. It teaches its victims to manage it quietly, and then it uses that quiet management as evidence that everything is fine. My daughter had become an expert at surviving something no child should have ever needed to survive. And the most unbearable part of everything I read in that notebook was the entry where she wrote, "I think this is just what living with a stepfather is like. Maybe I'm being too sensitive." He had made her question her own reality. And that, more than anything else, is what made the call I eventually made not just justified but necessary. Have you ever reached a point so far past anger that anger itself feels like a distant, almost quaint emotion, something that belongs to a version of you that still believed raising your voice or slamming a door could adequately respond to what was in front of you? Because that's where I was on the Thursday morning after I found that notebook. Not shaking. Not crying. Not pacing. I was sitting at my kitchen table at 6:45 in the morning with a cup of coffee I hadn't touched, watching the steam rise and thin and disappear, running through every decision I had made in the last 18 months with a systematic, almost clinical focus of someone who has moved completely beyond emotion into something quieter and far more dangerous. Clarity. Marcus had left for work at 6:15. I had listened to his truck back out of the driveway the same way I'd listened to it every morning, the same engine, the same reverse beep, the same pause at the bottom of the street before he turned and disappeared. Except this morning, I noticed that I felt nothing when the sound faded. No relief, no residual warmth, none of the complicated affection that had survived even the worst of my private doubts. Just silence, and the notebook sitting on the table in front of me, and a question I was finally ready to answer. The question wasn't whether to act. That had already been decided somewhere between page 12 and page 19 of my daughter's 43 pages. The question was how. Because here's what nobody tells you about being in my position. The moment you decide to dismantle someone's life, the weight of doing it correctly becomes almost paralyzing. Not because you doubt the decision, but because you understand, with absolute sobriety, that one misstep gives him the opportunity to reframe everything. One emotional outburst, one accusation without documentation, one move made from rage rather than strategy, and suddenly the narrative shifts. Suddenly, the hysterical woman becomes the story, and the man with the embroidered shirt and the good reputation walks away with his version intact. I could not allow that. My daughter had spent 4 months being precise and careful and strategic inside that notebook because she had already understood instinctively what I was only now catching up to, that the truth, in situations like this one, is not enough on its own. The truth needs to be delivered in a way that cannot be dismantled, redirected, or survived by the person it's aimed at. So I didn't call anyone that morning. I did something that required more discipline than any phone call. I went through the motions of a normal day. I woke my daughter for school. I made her breakfast. I did not tell her I had found the notebook because I needed her to behave naturally around Marcus for just a little while longer, and I knew that if she saw what was in my eyes that morning, she would know something had shifted permanently, and her behavior would shift with it. I kissed her forehead when she left. I washed the breakfast dishes. I went to work. I sat through 2 meetings. I responded to emails. And the entire time, underneath every ordinary surface of that ordinary Thursday, I was building something. I was mentally cataloging every name, every resource, every professional contact, every piece of documented evidence I had access to, and I was constructing an approach that Marcus, with all his careful reputation management and all his social armor and all his years of operating below the threshold of accountability, would have absolutely no framework to defend against. By the time I picked my daughter up from school that afternoon, I already knew exactly who I was going to call. I knew what I was going to say. And I knew that once I made that call, there would be no version of events in which Marcus's life looked anything like it did the day before. The only thing left was the courage to dial. Who do you call when the person you need to report has spent 18 months carefully building relationships with everyone around you? Who do you call when the man you're about to expose is charming enough, connected enough, and reputation-rich enough that a single phone call to the wrong person could get back to him before the echo of your voice fades? Because that was the calculation I was making on Friday evening, sitting in my car in the parking lot of my daughter's school 20 minutes after I dropped her at her friend's house, the one friend Marcus hadn't managed to fully eliminate from her life yet. I needed her somewhere safe and comfortable and entirely unaware of what her mother was about to set in motion. I had 3 options, and I cycled through them with the kind of focus that only arrives when you've spent 48 hours sleeping in 40-minute increments because your brain refuses to fully shut down. The first option was a direct call to the police. Straightforward, official, immediate, and also the most easily dismissed without physical evidence that met a specific threshold. The notebook was powerful, but handwritten entries from a teenager, without corroboration, in the hands of an officer who had never met my daughter and had no context for who Marcus was, I had no confidence that it wouldn't get filed somewhere quiet while Marcus got a courtesy heads-up from someone who knew someone. That happens. I was not willing to be naive about the way systems can fail when the wrong person has the right social connections. The second option was a family lawyer, someone who could advise me on protective orders, custody arrangements, and the legal architecture of removing Marcus from our home with as little warning as possible. That was necessary, but it was a second step, not a first one. A lawyer could build walls. I needed someone who could first confirm what I was standing in front of before the walls went up. The third option was the one I had been circling since Thursday morning. Her name was Denise. She was a licensed Child Protective Services investigator, not a hotline operator, not a general intake worker, but someone I had met professionally 3 years earlier through a community outreach event my workplace had co-sponsored. We weren't close. We had exchanged cards, connected briefly on a professional level, and spoken twice since at similar events. But I remembered her with a precision that told me my subconscious had been holding on to her contact information for a reason. Denise was the kind of professional who understood that the absence of a broken bone does not equal the absence of harm. She understood documentation. She understood the specific, patient, calculated cruelty that leaves no visible marks and enormous invisible ones. I found her number in my email archive from 3 years back. My hands were steady when I dialed. That steadiness surprised me, and then it didn't, because I understood by then that I had moved into a register of determined that lives on the other side of trembling. She answered on the 3rd ring. I identified myself, reminded her briefly of how we knew each other, and then I said, I need to report ongoing abuse of a minor in my household, and I need to understand what happens the moment I do, because I cannot afford for this to go wrong. There was a pause on her end. Not a hesitant pause, a professional one. The kind that means someone is already shifting into a different mode of attention. Then she said, tell me everything, and don't leave anything out. I talked for 40 minutes. I referenced the notebook. I described the escalation pattern. I gave her dates, descriptions, the arm grab, the Tuesday slap, Patricia's laugh, 11 months of below-threshold incidents that together formed something undeniable. When I finished, Denise was quiet for exactly 4 seconds. Then she said, this is already more documented than most cases I receive. We're opening a file tonight. Marcus went to sleep that Friday completely unaware that his carefully constructed world had just acquired an expiration date. Do you know what happens in the hours after a Child Protective Services file gets opened on someone who has spent years believing they are completely invisible to consequence? Nothing dramatic. Nothing that looks like justice arriving on horseback. What happens is quiet and procedural and completely invisible to the person it's aimed at, and that invisibility is precisely what makes it so effective. Marcus woke up Saturday morning, made his coffee, checked his phone, and existed inside his ordinary weekend with zero awareness that 12 hours earlier his name had entered a system designed specifically to dismantle people like him. He mowed the front lawn that Saturday. I watched him from the upstairs window. He waved at the neighbor across the street. The neighbor waved back. And I stood behind the curtain, understanding that I was the only person on that street who knew the clock had already started. Denise had walked me through the process before we ended our call Friday night. A file opening triggers a mandatory response timeline, an investigator assigned within 24 hours, an initial assessment scheduled within 72. She explained that the first phase would be information gathering, school records, medical records, any prior reports connected to my address or to Marcus specifically. That last part caught me. Prior reports. I asked her directly, had there been any? She told me she couldn't share that information with me at that stage. The way she said it told me everything her professional boundaries prevented her from confirming. By Monday, I had also made the call I should have made alongside Denise's, a family attorney named Robert who came recommended by a colleague and who, when I laid out the situation in his office on Monday afternoon with a notebook on the table between us, looked at me with the measured gravity of someone who has seen versions of this before and said, "You were right to document everything, and you were right to call CPS before calling me, because the sequence matters legally." He began drafting an emergency protective order application that same afternoon. I didn't tell Marcus. I went home, made dinner, and sat across the table from him while he talked about a property dispute he was managing at work, and I nodded in the appropriate places, and I thought about Robert's office and Denise's file and the sequence that was now entirely out of Marcus's hands. The investigator assigned to our case arrived at my daughter's school on Wednesday, not at our house, which was deliberate and strategic. Schools are neutral ground. Children speak differently in neutral ground than they do in spaces where the person they fear has left an imprint on every room. My daughter called me from the school office afterward, her voice carrying a specific kind of exhausted relief that I recognized as the sound of someone who has been holding something heavy for a very long time and has finally been permitted to set it down. She said, "Mom, I told them everything. I told them about the notebook and the arm and the doorway and all of it. I told her she was the bravest person I knew. I meant it in a way that language was not quite large enough to contain." What came out of that school interview expanded the investigation in a direction I hadn't fully anticipated. Because my daughter, in the process of telling her story to a trained investigator who knew exactly which questions to ask, mentioned something she had never written in the notebook. Something that had happened not in our house but at a family gathering 4 months earlier, at Patricia's house, with other people present, at least 2 of whom had witnessed something and said nothing. There were other witnesses. And now, for the first time, someone official was about to go find them. Do you know what happens in the hours after a Child Protective Services file gets opened on someone who has spent years believing they are completely invisible to consequence? Nothing dramatic. Nothing that looks like justice arriving on horseback. What happens is quiet and procedural and completely invisible to the person it's aimed at, and that invisibility is precisely what makes it so effective. Marcus woke up Saturday morning, made his coffee, checked his phone, and existed inside his ordinary weekend with zero awareness that 12 hours earlier his name had entered a system designed specifically to dismantle people like him. He mowed the front lawn that Saturday. I watched him from the upstairs window. He waved at the neighbor across the street. The neighbor waved back. And I stood behind the curtain, understanding that I was the only person on that street who knew the clock had already started. Denise had walked me through the process before we ended our call Friday night. A file opening triggers a mandatory response timeline, an investigator assigned within 24 hours, an initial assessment scheduled within 72. She explained that the first phase would be information gathering, school records, medical records, any prior reports connected to my address or to Marcus specifically. That last part caught me. Prior reports. I asked her directly, had there been any? She told me she couldn't share that information with me at that stage. The way she said it told me everything her professional boundaries prevented her from confirming. By Monday, I had also made the call I should have made alongside Denise's, a family attorney named Robert who came recommended by a colleague and who, when I laid out the situation in his office on Monday afternoon with a notebook on the table between us, looked at me with the measured gravity of someone who has seen versions of this before and said, "You were right to document everything, and you were right to call CPS before calling me, because the sequence matters legally." He began drafting an emergency protective order application that same afternoon. I didn't tell Marcus. I went home, made dinner, and sat across the table from him while he talked about a property dispute he was managing at work, and I nodded in the appropriate places, and I thought about Robert's office and Denise's file and the sequence that was now entirely out of Marcus's hands. The investigator assigned to our case arrived at my daughter's school on Wednesday, not at our house, which was deliberate and strategic. Schools are neutral ground. Children speak differently in neutral ground than they do in spaces where the person they fear has left an imprint on every room. My daughter called me from the school office afterward, her voice carrying a specific kind of exhausted relief that I recognized as the sound of someone who has been holding something heavy for a very long time and has finally been permitted to set it down. She said, "Mom, I told them everything. I told them about the notebook and the arm and the doorway and all of it. I told her she was the bravest person I knew. I meant it in a way that language was not quite large enough to contain." What came out of that school interview expanded the investigation in a direction I hadn't fully anticipated. Because my daughter, in the process of telling her story to a trained investigator who knew exactly which questions to ask, mentioned something she had never written in the notebook. Something that had happened not in our house but at a family gathering 4 months earlier, at Patricia's house, with other people present, at least 2 of whom had witnessed something and said nothing. There were other witnesses. And now, for the first time, someone official was about to go find them. Have you ever had a moment where something so unexpected surfaces that it reframes everything that came before it, not just the recent past but months and years of history you thought you already understood completely? where a single piece of information lands with such precision that it doesn't just confirm what you suspected, but expands it into a shape you weren't prepared for. Because that is what happened on the Tuesday of the third week of the investigation, when Denise called me at 11:47 in the morning. I remember the time because I was in the middle of a work call and I stepped out into the hallway to answer and never went back in, and told me that her team had found something during a routine records cross-reference that had immediately escalated the case to a senior investigator. Marcus had been investigated before. Not in this city. Not recently. But 7 years earlier, in a different state, in a different household, involving a different child, a girl, 9 years old at the time, the daughter of a woman he had dated for 14 months before that relationship ended abruptly enough that the ending itself had generated a report. The prior investigation had been closed without a finding, not because nothing happened, but because the child had recanted her initial statement after a period of time during which she remained living in close proximity to Marcus and his mother. Recantation under those specific circumstances, Denise explained to me with a careful, precise language of someone who has seen this pattern multiple times, is not the same as the absence of truth. It is one of the most predictable outcomes in cases involving child witnesses who lack protective separation from the person they're reporting. A 9-year-old girl. 7 years ago. A closed file that had never been connected to Marcus's current life because he had relocated across state lines 18 months after that investigation ended, which is to say, approximately the same window of time it took for the file to be closed, the heat to dissipate, and the careful reputation reconstruction to begin again somewhere new. Somewhere nobody knew his history. Somewhere he could start the performance fresh with a clean audience. I sat down on the hallway floor when Denise finished explaining. Not from weakness. My legs simply made a decision my brain hadn't issued yet. I sat there with my back against the wall, thinking about the mutual friend who introduced us. Thinking about the 7-month courtship and the birthday card with the handwritten note. Thinking about how precisely, how efficiently, how expertly the early months of our relationship had been engineered to produce exactly the level of trust required to get a man with a prior investigation into a home with a teenage girl. And I thought about that 9-year-old somewhere across state lines who had recanted her statement while still within his orbit, and I thought about what it cost her to do that, and I thought about what her life looked like after. Robert, when I called him immediately after hanging up with Denise, said 4 words before anything else. This changes everything strategically. The prior record, combined with the pattern documentation from my daughter's notebook, combined with the school interview testimony, combined with Patricia's documented intimidation campaign, combined with the 2 witnesses from the family gathering who had by this point agreed to provide formal statements, together they constructed something that no longer resembled a he-said-she-said domestic dispute. They constructed a pattern. A deliberate, mobile, repeating pattern of behavior that had survived one investigation through witness recantation and had been imported intact into a new state, a new relationship, and a new child. Marcus had built his life on the assumption that no one would ever connect the chapters. He had never considered that investigations have records. That records have cross-references. That cross-references, in the hands of a senior investigator with the right access and the right instinct, have a way of turning a closed file into an open case. The net had been cast 7 years ago. It had just taken this long to pull it closed. How do you watch someone's carefully constructed world collapse in real time and feel nothing close to satisfaction? Only a profound, bone-deep exhaustion and a grief that has no clean name because it isn't grief for the person falling apart. It's grief for every version of events in which this could have been prevented, in which a 9-year-old girl across state lines never had to recant anything, in which my daughter never needed a notebook. Because that is the emotional landscape I was standing in on the Thursday morning when 2 investigators and a uniformed officer arrived at our front door at 7:22 a.m., 12 minutes after Marcus's truck was confirmed still in the driveway, before he had left for work. While he was standing in our kitchen in his work shirt, drinking the last of his coffee like any other Thursday morning in a life he still believed was fundamentally intact. I had been told it was coming. Denise had given me a narrow window of preparation, not the exact time, but the day, and enough procedural context that I understood what to do with my daughter, which was to have her already gone. She was at her friend's house by 6:45, dropped there by me with a bag packed for 2 nights and a hug that I held for longer than usual without explaining why. She looked at me over her shoulder when she walked through her friend's front door. I smiled. She nodded once, slowly, with the particular gravity of a teenager who has learned to read her mother's expressions with forensic accuracy, and I understood that she already knew something significant was happening even without being told the specifics. Marcus heard the knock and answered the door himself. I was standing at the top of the stairs. I want to be precise about what I witnessed in the moment he opened that door and processed what was on the other side of it, because what I saw was not the explosive collapse of a guilty man cornered. What I saw was something far more revealing. His face went completely, perfectly still. Not shocked. Not confused. Still, in the way a face goes still when it has been privately rehearsing for a moment and the moment has finally arrived. That stillness lasted approximately 3 seconds before he assembled an expression of cooperative bewilderment, eyebrows slightly raised, hands open at his sides, the practiced body language of a man with nothing to hide. But I had seen the stillness first. And the stillness was the truth. He was taken in for formal questioning that morning. Not arrested. Not yet. That came later, after the district attorney's office reviewed the complete file and the prior record and the witness statements and made determinations I was not privy to in real time. But he left our house that Thursday morning in the company of investigators, and he did not come back. Robert had the emergency protective order finalized and served before noon. By 2 p.m. Marcus's employer had been formally notified of the investigation's nature and he was placed on immediate administrative leave, the embroidered shirt and the company truck suddenly representing a professional identity that was dissolving faster than he could process. Patricia called me 4 times that afternoon. I answered none of them. The 5th time she called, she left a voicemail. 3 minutes and 40 seconds of a woman oscillating between fury and desperation, threatening legal action, calling me names I will not repeat, and then, in the final 30 seconds, doing something I had not anticipated. She cried. Real tears, or real enough, and she said, through them, that Marcus was all she had and that I had destroyed her family. I saved that voicemail. Not for legal purposes. Robert already had everything he needed. I saved it because I needed to remember, on the harder days ahead, that the people who enable harm rarely see themselves as enablers. They see themselves as victims of the person who finally said stop. How do you watch someone's carefully constructed world collapse in real time and feel nothing close to satisfaction? Only a profound, bone-deep exhaustion and a grief that has no clean name, because it isn't grief for the person falling apart, it's grief for every version of events in which this could have been prevented, in which a 9-year-old girl across state lines never had to recant anything, in which my daughter never needed a notebook. Because that is the emotional landscape I was standing in on the Thursday morning when 2 investigators and a uniformed officer arrived at our front door at 7:22 a.m., 12 minutes after Marcus's truck was confirmed still in the driveway, before he had left for work. While he was standing in our kitchen in his work shirt, drinking the last of his coffee like any other Thursday morning in a life he still believed was fundamentally intact. I had been told it was coming. Denise had given me a narrow window of preparation, not the exact time, but the day, and enough procedural context that I understood what to do with my daughter, which was to have her already gone. She was at her friend's house by 6:45, dropped there by me with a bag packed for 2 nights and a hug that I held for longer than usual without explaining why. She looked at me over her shoulder when she walked through her friend's front door. I smiled. She nodded once, slowly, with the particular gravity of a teenager who has learned to read her mother's expressions with forensic accuracy, and I understood that she already knew something significant was happening even without being told the specifics. Marcus heard the knock and answered the door himself. I was standing at the top of the stairs. I want to be precise about what I witnessed in the moment he opened that door and processed what was on the other side of it, because what I saw was not the explosive collapse of a guilty man cornered. What I saw was something far more revealing. His face went completely, perfectly still. Not shocked. Not confused. Still, in the way a face goes still when it has been privately rehearsing for a moment and the moment has finally arrived. That stillness lasted approximately 3 seconds before he assembled an expression of cooperative bewilderment, eyebrows slightly raised, hands open at his sides, the practiced body language of a man with nothing to hide. But I had seen the stillness first. And the stillness was the truth. He was taken in for formal questioning that morning. Not arrested. Not yet. That came later, after the district attorney's office reviewed the complete file and the prior record and the witness statements and made determinations I was not privy to in real time. But he left our house that Thursday morning in the company of investigators, and he did not come back. Robert had the emergency protective order finalized and served before noon. By 2 p.m. Marcus's employer had been formally notified of the investigation's nature, and he was placed on immediate administrative leave, the embroidered shirt and the company truck suddenly representing a professional identity that was dissolving faster than he could process. Patricia called me 4 times that afternoon. I answered none of them. The 5th time she called, she left a voicemail. 3 minutes and 40 seconds of a woman oscillating between fury and desperation, threatening legal action, calling me names I will not repeat, and then, in the final 30 seconds, doing something I had not anticipated. She cried. Real tears, or real enough, and she said, through them, that Marcus was all she had and that I had destroyed her family. I saved that voicemail. Not for legal purposes. Robert already had everything he needed. I saved it because I needed to remember, on the harder days ahead, that the people who enable harm rarely see themselves as enablers. They see themselves as victims of the person who finally said stop.